Hello and welcome to Speakers on Disruption, presented by Speakers Connection. I'm your host, Sarah Patnode. Bill Loveless and Jay Hakes are joining me today to discuss energy issues that cover a multitude of topics that impact business strategy. Both are at the forefront of what's happening on energy and environmental issues in Washington, D.C., across the U.S., and all around the world. They're connected at the highest levels of government, industry, and academia. We will discuss the responses of government, industry, and consumers to the threat of climate change. Welcome, Bill Loveless and Jay Hakes. Tell us about your background and what got you into this important topic on energy and climate change.
Well, I've been a reporter since the 1970s. I started out in newspapers up in New England and then worked my way down to Washington back around 1980 and have covered energy since that time. Of course, I lived through, like many of us, the gasoline shortages and the energy crises of the 1970s. So in a way, in a big way, my career has been framed by the emergence of energy as a major topic for the United States and for the world since the 1970s, and how much has changed over that period of time. I had the pleasure of working through the 80s, 90s, and into the century for the trade press from McGraw-Hill and Platts, and had a chance to dig that much deeper into these very topics. But boy, we've seen a lot of change take place over the last 40 years or so, and that change, I think, today is really only accelerating.
Yeah, I see a lot of similarity between my experience and Bill's. I was in both the academic world and the government world, and working on multiple different topics, but somehow or other I got dragged into energy. And I think that that Arab oil embargo was sort of a changing event for a lot of people. And it involved international issues, it involved our national economy. And so, in the 1980s, I became the Florida State Energy Director and working with other energy directors around the state. And most of it was geared to how can we use oil more efficiently and become less dependent on foreign sources. In the 1990s, I became the head of the Energy Information Administration, which is the data and analytic part of the U.S. Department of Energy. And there was a lot of interest in climate change evolving during that decade. We were in charge of measuring certain aspects of the climate, of the emissions problem. I was called on to testify before Congress about climate change issues. I found out they were quite controversial. And then since then, I've sort of split. My first two books have been focused on the oil issues mainly. But my next book, I'm looking at the history of the climate change debate. And that's the issue I think that's going to have the big impact going forward, probably even more than the oil dependence issue did before.
While climate change has wide-ranging business, economic, and social effects, for businesses, climate change can be linked to corporate strategy, risk, opportunity, financial performance, and shareholder value. Many companies are already experiencing its impacts, which affect different sectors in different ways to different degrees. PG&E has been making headlines recently, especially with their connection to the California wildfires. Are they the first visible victim among energy companies to climate crisis?
Well, they certainly could be, Sarah. The company was already struggling because of the fires that have occurred over the past year or so, where it was found that some of its equipment, transmission and distribution lines and all, had been responsible for some of the fires that had occurred. And now with these latest fires that are occurring in the Golden State, where we've seen once again where PG&E and even Southern California Edison have shut off electricity to hundreds of thousands of people in advance of these fires to try to forestall them. So imagine, large swaths of California now have been in the dark, as these utilities try to avoid setting more fires. So, and these fires, of course, they're, climate change isn't wholly responsible for them, but certainly the conditions that climate change that are the results of climate change are contributing to the winds and the heat and the dryness that's certainly intensifying these fires. So a company like PG&E on its heels it faces a very uncertain future right now, and in fact there's talk that the state may simply take over that company's grid. Will we see this happen in other places? I don't know, but you know that the electric power industry in the United States, as well as other utilities, gas and others, are looking to this to see how devastating these fires are, not to the very region, the businesses and homes and the forests and everything else, as well as to lives, but to the very electric infrastructure on which we all depend upon for our survival. It's perhaps it's come upon us quickly, and it's a very, very scary situation.
Yeah, the way that I look at it is that we've had damage from climate change before. For instance, the porosity of some of the hurricanes that have hit the shore. And this is not to say that climate change is the only thing that makes for a severe hurricane, but it does contribute to it. But in those cases, the losses would generally be covered by private insurance, and then the federal government often will appropriate the funds to make up the difference. So people, to some extent, can be made whole over a period of time. So it's not to say that it wasn't a terrible experience, but at least people are insured. I think when you get to the scale of the California fires, people are starting to see that if this keeps growing in its impact, can insurance forever step up to the plate and handle it? And will we see big corporations go bankrupt because of issues that are linked to climate change? So I do think it is a real canary in the coal mine, or probably much bigger than a canary in a coal mine. And, it doesn't get so much coverage because our country tends to cover things on the East Coast more than they do on the West Coast. And someone said, if these fires were going on around New York or Washington, it would be an even bigger story. But it's a big enough story that I think it's gotten people's attention. And so it may come to be remembered as a turning point in a way in how people look at the issue.
Yeah. And it's been, of course, if we watch the network news, we're seeing those horrifying pictures of the fires in California, and this aspect of it, the shut off of electricity to so many people by PG&E is certainly a big part of the story, because a lot of people are complaining about it. A few days ago, as we speak, these fires are still raging, and a few days before these fires really grew in their size and intensity, a lot of people were complaining about, hey, I'm out of electricity. Vineyards, for example, in Sonoma were complaining it's harvest time, and we can't afford to go any time at all without electricity, without losing our crop. Now, of course, the fires themselves have sort of taken over the picture and much of the attention and the news coverage and all. But I'll tell you, here's an issue that I think is one you don't hear much about on the network news, and that is, what effect does this have long term on the policies and plans that a state like California undertakes to address climate change? Because so much of that policy relies on electrification of things, electrification that's powered by renewable energy, preferably, and so that you're relying less on natural gas, or you're relying less on gasoline in your car because you're driving an electric vehicle. How viable are these options on which policymakers have put so much attention and reliance, if in fact the grid is not stable, if it's not reliable?
The historian in me wants to make one additional point. The great climate change scientist Roger Revelle wrote an article where he analyzed the impact of likely climate change on the hydrology of the United States, and he pointed out that some regions were vulnerable and others were not, based on the water table and things like that. And he pointed to California as a place that was vulnerable. And there are things that could have been done, like putting in different kinds of wires and preparing for it, that were not done. Now, that article was written in 1983. So I think what it suggests is that when we read some stuff that says, hey, this is a problem, people maybe should pay attention, because there are things, in most cases, there are things that can be done to prepare. But, we live in a country where, for good or ill, we wait till the problem happens and then we try to fix it. The thing about climate change, it's a problem that it's better to avoid in the first place if you possibly can.
This is why I like to talk with Jay, because, see, I'm the journalist who tends to look on current events and what's happening today, right? And I'll be fixated on the story as it evolves, day to day, sometimes even hour to hour. Jay can always pull something from the depths and breadth of his scholarship and research, and remind us that this idea isn't so new. This was thought about a long time ago, but we didn't do anything about it. So that's why I enjoy this, Jay.
Yeah, I think that is something that's so unique when you bring in the past and the present. And in the last, I would say maybe week or so, our president came out with an interesting tweet that he put out there. Trump threatens to cut U.S. funding for California wildfires, and he's pointing the blame, right, in stating that basically we don't see close to the level of burn in other states, as he is putting the governor on notice. And when you think about, we've got the state involved, we've got the company involved, and we have this big crisis going on. That's really, when we think about it from a leadership perspective on business, it's, this can really blow up to be quite a big deal. And then we go, well, then who's really in charge, right? Who needs to take the helm on this? So I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
We really need a mix of state and local and federal response, because first, these wildfires are happening not just in the forests and the woodlands in the state of California. They're happening in other areas too, many of them residential. So cleaning brush isn't necessarily the answer, but the response is the state. I mean, the state regulates, say, PG&E and SoCal Ed and the other utilities within California, but that's only over the distribution of energy, to the customers in the state. Then you have these transmission lines that traverse California to bring power in from the Pacific Northwest, for example. I mean, our grid doesn't stop at the border of a state; it goes across the state lines. And while the states have a lot of control within their borders, there's a lot that goes beyond their borders. And there you have agencies in Washington like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has some say over what's done for that infrastructure, transmission lines, for example. So you really need a combination of state and federal cooperation to address some of these issues. And I think historically we've more or less had that. We've always had some regional differences. California, for example, may look at many of these things differently than, say, the states in the South would. But by and large, there has been some coordination, some cooperation between Washington and the states. The problem now is Washington is sort of, ineffective at policy making on energy, or for that matter, just about anything these days, it seems. So we sort of have a vacuum in Washington in terms of coming up with constructive solutions to things. States, in the meantime, are going about this on their own and coming up with their own policies and solutions. States like California, for example, are very aggressive on this. They have a cap and trade program where, you seek to reduce carbon emissions by either penalizing companies for them or offering them the option of trading credits or obtaining credits for those that they do. Other states are adopting that as well. So we kind of have a mishmash right now of state policy, and over time it can prove to be problematic if you're looking to solve a problem as big as climate change, which knows no boundaries.
Yeah, over half the states now have renewable portfolio standards where they require a minimum amount of renewable energy production. And it's found in red states and blue states. And it's really, over the last 20 years, been one of the major factors in improving the technology for wind and solar. If you build a lot of wind plants in Texas, for instance, which is a big wind state, the more windmills they build, the cheaper they get, because they learn through the process to how to produce them more efficiently. So even if you're in a state that was kind of low or slow to get involved, you benefit from what they did in Texas. So this is a case where the federal system has been helpful in ways. And of course, now the big fight is over the automobile. And will states like California be allowed to have more stringent requirements for automobile efficiency than the federal government has? Historically, they've been allowed to do that. But that's one of the things on the government side that everybody's going to be paying very close attention to in the coming years, because that fight is going to be there for a while.
Yeah, that's going to be a big fight, and we're already seeing where the automakers are divided. Some supporting the Trump administration's call to pull back on those fuel efficiency standards that were set during the Obama administration, and other automakers siding with California, which has always had a prerogative to set its own standards, something the Trump administration wants to revoke. But some automakers are sticking with California on that. So yeah, that's a mess, and who knows how that's going to get resolved. On Jay's point on the parts of the country where there's tremendous wind power potential, for example, certainly Texas, Oklahoma is a good example of that. But I'll tell you, one big problem in this country is getting that power to markets. It's not always as easy as you might think it should be, because of the difficulty of building transmission lines across state boundaries. Any given state can object to a proposal to build a power line that would traverse its territory without necessarily providing any useful, without delivering any energy there. Say it's delivering the power off to Chicago or someplace. A state like Kansas may object, or Arkansas. But there's no good solution to that right now. They've tried to pass legislation, and in Congress, they passed legislation in Congress, but it fell flat because of court battles. Russell Gold of the Wall Street Journal has written a tremendous book on one company in Texas that's tried to address this and failed by building power lines on its own. That is, I think that's going to be another of the major battles we face in this country going forward.
I think that when we listen to going back to PG&E and we look at, the planning, what prevention could have meant in a situation like this or others, as we've outlined so far in this discussion, I think we can now look to the future. And Jay and Bill, you both touched on it with the automobile industry. Let's talk about that, because in recent news, Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer outlined his vision for boosting the number of electronic vehicles on the road, hoping the U.S. will have an all-electric fleet by 2040. And the reason why this is important is transportation accounts for nearly 1/3 of America's carbon output, which is the largest sector of carbon pollution in the U.S., according to data from the EPA. It also surpasses greenhouse gas emissions for both power plants and industry. What are the major considerations or points to consider when implementing a large climate initiative like this, in your opinion?
Well, I agree with your comments and Senator Schumer's that the transportation right now is the big problem area that we have to pay most attention to. I would say from a technical standpoint, it would not be possible for the U.S. to have an all-electric fleet by 2040, because to do that, all new cars for sale would have to be electric by, say, 2030. Automobiles going to be on the road these days for at least 10 years. I do think it is possible. It's a push, but I think we could be to the point where in 2040, all the new cars would be electric vehicles. And I don't think this is a sacrifice. I think these will be better cars. his approach is to sort of throw money at it and provide incentives, and I just think we can't afford to do that, and it's really not necessary. If we just follow the path we're on to require the cars to become more and more efficient, they will over time have to be electric cars to meet that standard. So we're kind of on the road there if we don't step backwards on the path we're on to get to these more efficient automobiles. And we will need some tax incentives and to get them on the road with the early adopters. But I think this is close to being something that's doable with those caveats. And I think for me, it's a fun part of the process to see the improvements in an automobile. So that's where a lot of the focus needs to be.
Yeah, and the fuel efficiency standards certainly are important, and that's what's concerning to many over the battle that's taking place in Washington right now over efforts to roll back those standards, because they have driven efficiencies in the auto fleet that would not have happened otherwise without a policy push. I mean, this is a good example where policy matters. There are simply some things where you're not going to see wholesale changes in a market unless you have the policy to drive it. That said, companies have responded. The automakers have responded with a lot of new technologies. I mean, hardly a day passes when you don't read of another commitment or another announcement or breakthrough by some automaker in terms of their plans for building more electric vehicles in the years ahead. In many ways, they're responding to the government mandates, but they're also responding to consumer interest as well. Maybe not so much yet in the United States, certainly in some other countries. I think we're seeing that. The wild card in all this too is the price of gasoline, right? As long as Americans love cheap gasoline, they love still their perception of energy is what the price they see posted at their corner gas station. As long as gasoline is cheap, they're buying bigger vehicles, and that makes it difficult, I think, to turn around the fleet as quickly as many would like to do it.
Yeah, I think the question is, where do we have to get to where people won't feel range anxiety that their battery's going to give out on them in the electric car? And I don't know what that is. Maybe it's somewhere around 350 miles, but right now the electric vehicles are well over 200. And so for a person that's commuting, an electric vehicle will meet the bill. But the batteries are going to have to improve, and they will. They'll get lighter, they'll get cheaper, and they'll last longer. So that's where I think we're headed. Yeah,
and there may be some fleets too. Cars are of course what we look at, but I was interviewing the Congresswoman Kathy Castor recently, who's the chairman of the House Special Committee on Climate Crisis for the Columbia Energy Exchange podcast. And, I was asking her, what are some of the things you've seen out there that encourage you, that there could be some to change in the ways that we live, work, and drive? And she brought up electric school buses. And, I hadn't really given too much thought to that, but she had toured a company that manufactures these buses in the United States and felt that, heck, if there was a commitment across the country to electrify the school bus fleet in the United States, think of the opportunity it would provide for that sort of manufacturing in this country, as well as the impact it would have on emissions as well, not to mention nicer buses for the kids to ride in. We've seen in other countries like China where there's been a massive conversion or transformation to electric bus transportation in that country, again, driven by the government. But you can see where fleets perhaps may be where this takes place. Maybe it's in trucking. We hear a lot more about trucking and the potential for even driverless transportation, trucking vehicles going forward. So there may be ways. It may not just be, the car, the Tesla or whatever, the Leaf or whatever that we're thinking about right now. It may be other forms of transportation as well.
Yeah, I mean the big challenge when you're looking at the big picture of climate change is what are we going to do about airplanes? And I think the general opinion among most of us has been, well, that's a big problem. They can't run on batteries. But there's actually a scientist at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh who thinks that we're not that far away of being able to do at least shorter flights with all batteries on airplanes. So that I don't know if that's science fiction or he's an eminent scientist. So, but we have to sort of think big about some of these things if we're trying to get to this zero carbon future, which is not easy.
So thank you for those responses. I want to take a moment and, with looking ahead, what do you think that the major networks might not be telling us as it relates to the impacts of climate change on business and the business sector? What can you share with us from your opinion on that?
Well, I think the TV people are good at the visual part of it. So they can show a storm, they can show a fire, they can show melting ice caps. But you got to dig in a little deeper. And then, of course, when they have people on, they tend to be people who are the advocates for doing the crash programs or doing nothing. And sometimes people, construct an argument to prove their point that doesn't always provide a full understanding. And I guess if there's one thing that I'd like to emphasize that gets overlooked is that with climate change, because the carbon stays in the atmosphere for over a century, and because water can absorb heat, and that delays the impact on the planet, that a lot of the stuff that we're seeing today is baked in the cake. And it's actually, even if we start doing everything right, it's going to keep getting worse for a while. And the environmental activists don't want to tell you that because they're afraid that at some point you just decide to stick your head in the sand and do nothing because you get too discouraged. And the do nothing people don't want to tell you that because they want to claim it's not a problem. So, I think we have to kind of maturely look at this and say, yes, we're making decisions that are affecting things 20 or 30 years down the road, and that's a little different way of looking at things than most people in government and business might have been used to. So I think you just have to be honest with people about that if we really start tackling this problem, it's going to slow things down and maybe eventually even stabilize the climate. But I think the reason this is relevant is that, to me, it's not analogous to World War II, where you go in for 5 years, you fight really hard, you suffer, and then at the end of the 5 years, you're done. And I think with this, it's going to take a sustained effort, year after year, decade after decade, to achieve what needs to be achieved in a long range perspective.
It's been a big. This has been a big topic in the journalism professional community in the past in recent months. There was a big campaign launched by the Columbia Journalism Review and the magazine The Nation back in April, called Covering Climate Now, and they were extremely critical of the news media for what they considered to be inadequate coverage of climate change. And this had to do with the networks, of course, as well as newspapers and digital and every other form of media. And I think there was, I certainly agree with that point of view. There simply has not been the degree of coverage that is necessary given the magnitude of the problem. And part of it is when it comes to networks and all, it's a matter of ratings. Some stories simply aren't going to garner the ratings that others do. Especially if you get technical, it's not very sexy. It doesn't get a lot of eyeballs, and therefore, when you're producing programs, you tend to shy away from those kinds of stories. And unfortunately, I think it's the nature of the media today. I mean, I think there once was the perception and the commitment among major news networks that they were a public service, not so much a commercial entity, and that they reported the news as they saw fit. This campaign, I think, has awakened a lot of producers and editors, though. I know there's a large number of news organizations. I think last time I looked, there was some 250 news outlets from across the U.S. In the world, big outlets, small, print, digital, TV, and radio that agreed to give more and better coverage to climate change. But it's still difficult. It's again easy to portray the massive hurricanes and the devastation they cause, and discuss the effect that climate change may have on some of the intensity of those storms, or to do the same with the wildfires in California, as well as the devastating storms we see in other parts of the world these days. But explaining that is difficult in the time allotted, and I think that all we can do is perhaps get a sense of what's going on from the major networks, and then hope that they dive deeper at some point in a special program, or maybe in a digital format or someplace, to tell the story in much more clarity and in much more detail. But that can be difficult.
Yeah, because scientists tend to write to each other, and they talk in a very technical language. And of course, the science tends to work in the metric system. So they say, okay, the temperature is going to go up 2 degrees Celsius. But most people don't realize, well, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So, the scientific article doesn't really translate that much. And 3.6 actually sounds worse than 2.0. And then you realize that it's variable. It's more than that some places and less than that other places. And that's actually causes additional problems. So, it's not to be critical of anybody. I think a lot of reporters really try very hard, and Bill and I in our communications, we try very hard to tackle some of these scientific issues and not use acronyms and things like that are kind of off-putting to the average person. So it's a challenge, but it's one that everybody has to address.
Yeah, one thing I thought is that if we saw, I would like to see the meteorologists on our local TV station discussing this more. And I think you're beginning to see some of that, or I read you do. I can't say I'm seeing it locally in the Washington, D.C. area with the stations here. But I hear that weather folks across the country are discussing climate change a bit more than they have in the past. I was encouraged to read today, for example, that the Weather Channel tonight is going to have a discussion of climate change with the Democratic candidates for president, and I believe that some meteorologists will be included in that conversation. That's good when you have the Weather Channel, which many people turn to get their weather, talking about climate change. Now they're doing it in sort of a political aspect, but nevertheless, it's the Weather Channel doing this. I think this is meaningful and to many of us. And can go a long way towards explaining to people what's going on.
What do you want to leave our listeners with? What do you want to give them as some of your final thoughts now that they've gone through this almost 30-minute journey with us on this audio segment? What would you like the business leaders to think about in some parting words?
Well, this is a big problem to solve. But I sort of enjoy the problem-solving process. It makes life on Earth more fun, I guess, in a way, if you have to struggle a little bit to maintain what you have. Our infrastructure around the world was built for the climate that we've had for, several thousand years. And so, we're entering into this strange area where, it's not to say that over millions of years the Earth's climate hasn't changed a lot, but with a settled human population, we haven't seen anything like this. So, this is going to call for a lot of ingenuity, political wisdom, technological advance, and when I use the word political wisdom, that may be viewed as an oxymoron by some people, but I think at times our society does respond to challenges, and this is a challenge. I think everybody wants to be able to look their grandchildren in the face and say we did the best we could. So that's the way I look at it. It's a problem out there to be solved, and let's find the ways at the corporate level, government level, journalism. Everybody's has to kind of up their game to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, as someone who lives in Washington D.C., I sort of clutch at the suggestion of political wisdom, Jay. But nevertheless,
well, it's hard in Louisiana too.
But you're right that in the end, we need to greater minds need to address these things in a sound way, and I think a lot of it just simply begins at sort of in our own homes, in our own businesses, what's happening in the environment around us. It may simply be we're seeing record temperatures by month this year, and maybe where we live, we're affected by that. Certainly, I feel it here in the Mid-Atlantic region. It could be some other climate patterns that are simply different than we've seen previously. And so I think understanding what's happening locally, and I think there certainly is more and better information out there. We were, I was kind of grumbling before about the inadequacy to some extent we've seen over the years and coverage of this topic by the media, but it is improving. And there are sources, and if you care, there are plenty of outlets you can find to get more information, or to simply have conversations with people. I mean, that's one reason that we enjoy doing what we do, Jay, is that we simply enjoy this conversation. And we find that as we visit people in different parts of the country, it becomes much more localized to us. We think in the context of the environment in which they are. And we find that there's sort of a common ground in terms of the implications of climate change and what is happening globally and in our country and all. But there are also very real impacts within a specific region or within a specific industry. And what's usually most rewarding in these conversations is we find out from the people we talk to what some of their concerns are, or their questions they have. Why should they? Why do you think about this? I've been asked repeatedly by people who are skeptical of the climate changes occurring, of why do you as a journalist subscribe to the scientific theories that say, yes, in fact, climate change is occurring, it's human induced, and it's a big problem. I can explain that in much more detail, why I feel that way. But nevertheless, it's good to have that dialogue with people, because it's only by doing that we come to some sort of common agreement on what needs to be discussed, even if there isn't a common agreement among us on what needs to be done. The dialogue, the discussion is important, and finding solutions and answers is important, and there's opportunities to do that.
Thank you again for your time today. Make climate change a top priority by educating your senior level business leadership on what may lie ahead as we face new climate control challenges in your industry. Reach out to Speakers Connection to discover how Bill Loveless and Jay Hakes can provide the background, the explanation, and most importantly, the stories that will make sense of these vital changing dynamics in energy. And given the growing concern over climate change, there's no better time for this discussion. Thank you for listening.